Chronicon Mundi.
Dive deep into history.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We are continuing our historical journey through the complex and, let's be honest, often terrifying landscape of radical Islam.
We are.
Today, we're focusing on a really pivotal era, the second wave of global jihad.
And this phase is, it's almost entirely defined by one thing.
The direct strategic confrontation between Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda and what they called the far enemy.
The United States. That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
We're stepping right into the period from, say, 1996, which is when bin Laden makes his formal declaration of war, all the way through about 2003.
Right. 2003, when Al-Qaeda Central was, well, for all intents and purposes, militarily neutralized.
Exactly. So our mission here is to really understand the ideological engine, what powered this radical pivot towards America. We need to look at the strategic audacity of their operations and, critically, the immediate, overwhelming backlash.
A backlash that resulted in the organization's near total defeat within just 2 years of its greatest, or I guess you'd say most infamous, operational success.
It's a fascinating and tragic arc.
What stands out immediately when you dive into the source material is that this shift wasn't gradual. It wasn't incremental.
No, not at all.
This was a deliberate, total redirection of resources, of ideology. Bin Laden decided that the traditional focus on fighting local Arab regimes, the near enemy, was, well, a dead end.
A complete dead end. He concluded the only way to achieve their ultimate goals was to go for the top, to strike the ultimate global power.
The head of the snake.
America. This is a moment the regional conflict really, truly became globalized. And it was all centered on this one specific grievance that bin Laden felt was the most immediate danger to the sanctity of the Muslim world.
Okay, so let's start right there with that fundamental epical pivot. Because for decades, the intellectual and the physical energy of groups like the Muslim Brotherhood or, say, Egyptian Islamic Jihad, it was all dedicated to internal revolution.
Right, overthrowing what they viewed as apostate Muslim rulers.
So why did bin Laden, who was himself a product of the Saudi establishment, why did he decide to break with this tradition and focus everything on the U.S.?
Well, the shift was definitely strategic, but you're right to point to his background, because the catalyst was intensely personal for him. It was rooted deeply in the geography of the Arabian Peninsula.
Okay.
So while he certainly shared that disdain for local rulers, the near-enemy group's whole thing, he viewed the presence of American forces in Saudi Arabia as this monumental, intolerable violation.
A crisis so severe it just trumped everything else.
It trumped all other jihadi objectives.
And we are talking, of course, about Saudi Arabia, the location of Mecca and Medina.
The land of the two holy places.
Yeah.
Precisely. To bin Laden and his followers, the presence of U.S. troops who were stationed there after the 1991 Gulf War.
To protect the kingdom from Saddam Hussein.
Yes. That presence was an unprecedented calamity. This wasn't just a political disagreement. You have to understand, this was viewed as an existential, a theological threat to the purity of the land.
And it required an immediate military response.
It demanded it.
It's a remarkable reversal, isn't it? To turn a protector into the primary target. So King Fahd's decision to accept American and Western forces in 1991, that was it. That was the foundational grievance.
That was the lightning rod. Bin Laden saw the king's ongoing support for, secular laws, and then you couple that with the continued presence of foreign troops on what he considered sacred soil.
It was a profound betrayal.
Profound betrayal. His response in 1996 was this famously frank and uncompromising fatwa, the declaration of war against the Americans occupying the land of the two holy places.
A document that really defined a generation. But what gave it its power? Beyond just stating the grievance, how did it so successfully move the target from Riyadh all the way to Washington, D.C.?
The strength of that 1996 declaration lay in its dual nature. It was a really sophisticated document. It married this deeply rooted religious legitimation for aggressive jihad with astute political analysis of Muslim grievances.
So it wasn't just theological jargon.
No, not at all. It offered a clear, actionable political message. Bin Laden basically presented himself as the sole spearhead of resistance against the American-Saudi alliance. He explicitly vowed to expel U.S. troops.
He was effectively arguing that the near enemy, the Saudi regime, was just a puppet.
Just a puppet, and to defeat the puppet, you had to cut the strings.
Held by the puppet master, the United States.
Exactly.
That makes a certain kind of cold political sense, but as we've established in this world, political strategy has to be underpinned by theological rigor to justify declaring war not just on an external power, but also to, nullify the legitimacy of fellow Muslim regime. He needed a massive theological hammer.
And he found one. That hammer was the concept of al-wala wal-bara.
Al-wala wal-bara.
This is the central theological concept that underpinned the entire strategic shift. Translated, it means loyalty and disavowal.
Loyalty and disavowal, okay.
It mandates that Muslims must demonstrate absolute loyalty, that's al-wala, toward Islam and fellow Muslims, while actively making a complete disavowal bara from all things outside the fold, especially infidels or kuffar.
Now, this concept isn't new, right? This has been part of Islamic creed for centuries. What made bin Laden's application of it so radical in the 1990s?
It was the context. The context had changed everything. The debate over al-wala wal-bara was initially energized by the Saudi awakening movement, the Sawa.
The Sawa.
Right. These were influential, university-educated Saudi clerics. They combined a kind of Salafi textual rigidity with a, let's say, cautious political activism. They were already highly critical of the West's influence and culture.
So the Sawa movement kind of set the stage for this critique. What specifically did they argue about the American presence?
Well, Sawa argued that King Fahd's alliance with the United States was an unacceptable act of al-wala, loyalty towards infidels.
Even if the goal was to repel Saddam Hussein?
Even then. They saw this relationship as undermining the religious and moral honor of the Muslim community. There's this influential work by Safar bin Abd al-Rahman al-Hawali, who explicitly warned that the Crusader invasion of the Arab Peninsula has already undermined the honor of every Muslim.
So for them, this danger required immediate bara, disavowal, and expulsion.
Yes.
Okay, but this is a crucial distinction. The Sawa were advocating for political and religious pressure, right? Pushing the government to reverse course. They weren't calling for armed revolution against the regime itself.
Exactly. They were critical activists, but they were operating within the system. Bin Laden takes this influential, widespread critique, and he pushes it one massive revolutionary step further.
He weaponized the concept.
He weaponized it to declare war on the regime itself.
How does he make that leap from they shouldn't have foreign troops here to the rulers are apostates? That requires invoking takfir.
That is the crucial explosive leap. Bin Laden concluded that the Saudi regime's failure to make bara from the West, their continued legislative support for the American presence, it nullified their legitimacy entirely.
He used their failure to follow this religious mandate as grounds for takfir, for excommunication.
He did. In August 1995, bin Laden issued this declaration of disbelief against the Saudi government.
The argument being that the Saudi rulers had violated Tawhid al-Hakimiyya, the singular sovereignty of God.
Precisely. Tawhid al-Hakimiyya is a concept that was heavily developed by ideologues like Sayyid Qutb. It asserts that all legislation, all political sovereignty, must derive solely from the Sharia.
And bin Laden's argument was?
He argued that whoever arbitrates between people by other than what God has revealed, he indeed has disbelieved and expelled himself from the folds of Islam. By adopting secular laws, and, more importantly, by pledging allegiance to the infidels through the U.S. alliance, the Saudi rulers had, in his view, negated their claim to be Muslim leaders.
So the ideological sequence is crystal clear. The U.S. presence violates al-wala wal-bara. The failure to expel the U.S. violates Tawhid al-Hakimiyya.
And therefore,
the regime is an infidel regime subject to takfir. This completely rationalized the pivot away from the local struggle and positioned the U.S. as the core target.
It provided the fully formed, confrontational, and militaristic doctrine he needed to justify outright rebellion and, well, eventually, a global war. The ideological groundwork for striking the head of the snake was fully laid by 1996.
Okay, so by 1996, bin Laden has the finances, the organization, and this radical ideological basis. But he needed experienced operational leadership, some intellectual heft, to really take on the United States.
He did.
This brings us to the strategic union with Ayman al-Zawahiri, which solidified Al-Qaeda Central in 1998.
This is often called a marriage of necessity, not love.
A marriage of necessity.
Zawahiri was the quintessential Qutbian ideologue. I mean, he was consumed by the near-enemy fight, that decades-long struggle against secular regimes in Egypt. But his organization, Tanzim al-Jihad, had been, well, effectively eradicated by Mubarak's security forces in the mid-90s.
So Zawahiri, the veteran revolutionary, he was in exile, his entire organization dismantled, facing arrest or worse.
His situation was dire. I mean, he was expelled from Sudan in 1996. He was even briefly imprisoned in Dagestan after traveling under a false identity. He was organizationally bankrupt and completely dependent on bin Laden's wealth and his infrastructure in Afghanistan for sheer survival.
So Zawahiri, despite his intellectual superiority, was basically forced to accept bin Laden's strategic pivot toward the far enemy.
He had no choice.
What was Zawahiri's critical contribution then? What did he bring that made this global strategy viable?
Zawahiri provided the critical, intellectual, and conceptual justification for the transnational strategy. He had witnessed the failure of the near-enemy strategy firsthand. After decades of struggle, the Egyptian regimes were stronger, not weaker.
And the jihadist movement had failed to win over the broader Muslim population.
Exactly. Zawahiri concluded that the local fight was just ineffective because the global patron, the U.S., always rushed in to prop up the local regimes.
So instead of retreating or changing tactics, Zawahiri's answer was to scale up the conflict to a totally different dimension.
A completely different dimension. His argument was audacious. He said the solution was to drag the United States into a total war with the Ummah, the global Muslim community.
To awaken them from political apathy.
To awaken them. He believed that only a direct, massive confrontation with the U.S. would expose the true nature of what he called the Crusader-Zionist conspiracy, and that would force Muslims to rally to the jihadi banner.
This marks the ideological peak of the second wave then. You have the merging of Qutbian revolutionary theory with bin Laden's Saudi-influenced focus on expelling occupiers.
And this synergy immediately produced the definitive public statement in 1998.
The February 1998 Fatwa.
Issued under the new banner of the World Islamic Front. It was titled Jihad Against Jews and Crusaders. It was a document of maximalist ambition. It moved beyond the specific grievances in Saudi Arabia to generalize the conflict globally.
And what was the explicit legal mandate inside that fatwa?
The fatwa explicitly mandated that the killing of Americans, and this is key, both military personnel and civilians, and their allies anywhere they could be found, was an individual duty for every Muslim. A fard ain.
An individual duty.
They frame this not just as resistance, but as a continuation of historical jihad applied globally against the U.S. as the single greatest external occupier of Muslim lands.
This is where we have to pause and address the most controversial aspect of Al-Qaeda's doctrine, the wholesale targeting of non-combatants. Because traditional Islamic jurisprudence is quite clear on protecting civilians. How did they construct a legal argument to override centuries of established law?
This required a radical and many would say blasphemous reinterpretation of traditional jurisprudence. They relied heavily on the concept of qisas.
Qisas, equal retaliation.
Equal retaliation or retribution. A concept normally confined to criminal law, specifically private law.
Right. Qisas is typically an eye for an eye for cases of murder or physical harm between individuals. How do you bridge that gap and apply private law retribution to an international conflict involving millions of citizens? That seems like a monumental legal stretch.
It is the defining innovation of Al-Qaeda's legal theorists. Figures like Yusuf al-Uyari argued that if qisas offers restitution for individuals who are wronged, then it is even more correct and more worthy to deal with the kafir harbi, the belligerent disbeliever, on an international scale.
But how do they define a civilian in Ohio or an office worker in London as a kafir harbi, a belligerent? That's where this doctrine of vicarious liability comes in.
That's the key, vicarious liability. Al-Qaeda theorists argued that in modern democracies, citizens are not passive subjects. They're active participants.
So if you vote for war, if you pay taxes that fund the military,
or even if you just implicitly support the government through your residence and consent, you are held equally liable. They claim that these citizens are like a fighter, or at least a supporter, just by virtue of their citizenship.
That's a direct rejection of the Geneva Conventions, of most established international law.
A total rejection.
Yeah.
And to cement their argument, they often pointed back to historical precedents, claiming the West had already blurred this line. They explicitly referenced the U.S. use of atomic bombs against Japanese cities.
Right.
They said, and this is a quote, "We do not differentiate between those dressed in military uniforms and civilians. American history does not distinguish between civilians and military. They are the ones who used nuclear bombs against Nagasaki."
So their justification was twofold. One, every citizen in a democracy is complicit, and two, the West forfeited its right to claim civilian immunity because of its own actions.
That synthesized doctrine of vicarious liability became their theological cornerstone. It allowed them to frame mass casualty attacks against non-combatants, not as terrorism or murder, but as divinely sanctioned equal retribution cases for what they saw as Western aggression.
And without that twisted legal framework, 9/11 could never have been justified internally.
Never.
So with the ideology crystallized and the organization cemented by 1998, Al-Qaeda immediately enters this period of escalation. They're proving they're a global organization capable of lethal action.
Their first major operational success came swiftly in August 1998. The near-simultaneous bombings of the U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania.
The attacks killed hundreds, mostly African civilians, but critically, it showed Al-Qaeda's ability to coordinate these huge operations across different theaters at the same time.
And that success, even with the U.S. retaliation of cruise missile strikes, it clearly emboldened the leadership.
It convinced key military figures, like Mohammed Atef, that they were ready to revisit more ambitious plans.
It did. But before the final devastating act, they executed a kind of calculated dress rehearsal that reveals their stunning strategic logic. The attack on the USS Cole.
October 2000. 2 suicide bombers ram an explosives-laden boat into a Navy destroyer while it's refueling in Yemen.
Yep.
17 American sailors killed. A sophisticated, high-impact military strike.
It was. But as you say, it was more than just a successful attack. It was intentional provocation.
It was bait.
It was calculated bait, a conscious move to manipulate U.S. foreign policy.
Right.
The objective wasn't just to inflict casualties, but to force an overreaction. We know this from reports that came out later.
Can you elaborate on that? What did they hope to gain by attacking a U.S. military vessel in a relatively remote port?
Al-Qaeda's leaders believed that even a successful attack like the Cole wouldn't be enough to force the U.S. to withdraw. They understood American pride in politics. Instead, the military commander, Abu Hafs al-Masri, reportedly said, "We did the Cole, and we wanted the United States to react."
They wanted a reaction.
And if they reacted, they are going to invade Afghanistan, and that's what we want. Then we will start holy war against the Americans, exactly like the Soviets.
That is the crucial insight. They were actively trying to draw the U.S. into a ground war in Afghanistan. They wanted an invasion.
They absolutely wanted an invasion. Their entire strategy was modeled on the successful Afghan jihad of the 1980s, which played a major role in the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Right. The Soviet invasion unified disparate Muslim factions, radicalized youth.
And it transformed the struggle into this, pious, liberating campaign.
So bin Laden's theory of victory was to replicate that model. Strike the enemy so viciously that they commit to an expensive, drawn-out ground occupation.
An occupation that unites the Imama against the invader, draining the superpower's resources and legitimacy in the process.
They figured an invasion would just prove their whole narrative.
Exactly. That America was indeed engaged in a crusader war against Islam. This would validate their status as the vanguards of the Ummah and finally secure the loyalty and support of the Muslim masses that Zawahiri felt they had failed to get during the near-enemy phase.
The Cole attack was a loud invitation.
It was an invitation to the U.S. to step right into their trap.
And that audacious strategy to provoke total war culminates in the catastrophic events of September 11, 2001.
The foundational idea for that large-scale symbolic killing of Americans came from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, KSM.
Right. He had been involved in anti-American plots going back to the mid-90s. He's the one who presented bin Laden with the concept of using airplanes as missiles.
He was, and bin Laden took that concept and just dramatically scaled it up, formalized it, and brought it under Al-Qaeda's direct control after the 98 embassy bombings.
And he took direct personal charge.
Yes, modifying KSM's proposal and focusing the plan on these high-value symbolic targets in the U.S. homeland. And a key feature of the planning was maintaining the strictest secrecy.
The secrecy was so extreme, it even extended to the highest ranks of Al-Qaeda Central.
It did. We know bin Laden was fiercely protective of the plan. Even Ayman al-Zawahiri, his chief ideological partner and second-in-command, was reportedly only informed of the specific timing and the final targets a mere 24 hours before the operation.
24 hours, that shows an almost unilateral control.
It really does.
And the selection of operatives also shows how complex this was. This wasn't a standard suicide bombing with seasoned Afghan fighters.
No, it was a highly specialized team. Bin Laden realized he needed individuals who could seamlessly integrate into Western society and operate complex machinery. This led to the incorporation of the Hamburg cell Muhammad Atta and the others.
Because of their English fluency and technical education.
Precisely. And Atta was then designated the operational commander.
The target selection, the World Trade Center for finance, the Pentagon for the military, it all ties back to that core strategic aim we talked about, forcing a policy change.
That was the explicit calculation. Bin Laden firmly believed that only the mass killing of a large number of Americans in their homeland would be enough to shock the superpower into withdrawing. He wanted to demonstrate the immense cost of continued intervention.
He wanted a reaction, but a reaction of retreat and fear.
Yes.
The scale of the attack was, of course, devastating. Almost 3,000 non-combatant Americans killed. But the immediate aftermath revealed a profound strategic failure on bin Laden's part. A complete misreading of the American psyche.
A total misreading. He had predicted some kind of internal political fracturing, or at worst a localized confrontation. What he got instead was what's been termed an extreme response, out of proportion to the provocation.
Instead of cowing the U.S. into retreat, the attacks unified the country.
Unified the country, solidified NATO, and most critically, it reinvigorated America's willingness to project military power globally. He did not get a retreat. He got an overwhelming invasion.
The backlash came exactly as bin Laden had intended, in a way. The U.S. was provoked into a massive military response. But instead of unity and a Soviet-style quagmire, the consequence for Al-Qaeda was immediate ruin.
That's right. The U.S. invasion of Afghanistan began barely a month after 9/11, in October 2001.
And that month marked the beginning of the end for Al-Qaeda Central as a cohesive organization.
The invasion, supported by local Afghan militias, swiftly brought about the end of the Taliban regime and the downfall of the Taliban Al-Qaeda's essential host, its protector, its sanctuary. That was the direct, immediate, and disastrous consequence of bin Laden's reckless strategy.
The physical base was gone. And over the next 2 years, 2002 and 2003, the operational core of Al-Qaeda itself was just rapidly dismantled.
Right, 2003. The organization was, for all intents and purposes, virtually defeated, both geographically and operationally. Intelligence operations, often aided by international partners, led to the loss of most of its top operational leadership.
A steady process of capture or death.
A steady process. We're talking about the capture of key figures essential to the second wave.
The architect of 9/11 himself.
Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, KSM, was captured in Pakistan in March 2003. Abu Zubaydah, a senior operations coordinator, captured in 2002. High-value individuals were either killed in drone strikes or captured in joint raids.
And the core organization that had planned 9/11 was just reduced to these small, roving bands.
Disconnected bands, primarily confined to the remote border regions between Afghanistan and Pakistan.
So 2 years after launching their most spectacular attack, the organization that executed it was functionally neutralized. But this physical defeat was compounded by something maybe more damaging, a profound ideological backlash from within the broader jihadi movement itself.
That ideological failure is critical to understanding how the second wave ends. The consensus among many former jihadis, particularly those from larger, more localized groups, was that the armed struggle against the far enemy was a catastrophic strategic blunder.
And this critique came most forcefully from the Egyptian Islamic group Al-Ghama al-Islamiyya.
One of the largest and most influential jihadi organizations in the region before the crackdown, yes. Their leaders, many of them imprisoned in Egypt, they engaged in this profound introspection. They published comprehensive critiques in the early 2000s.
What was their specific indictment of bin Laden's strategy?
They argued that bin Laden and Al-Qaeda had fundamentally misunderstood the purpose and limits of violence.
How so?
They accused Al-Qaeda of waging jihad for the sake of jihad, basically arguing that bin Laden treated violence as an end in itself, rather than a means to a specific, achievable political or religious goal. They stressed that jihad is only one of the Muslims' duties. Jihad is a means, not an end.
So they felt Al-Qaeda's recklessness had just disproportionately sacrificed the safety and interests of the Ummah.
Precisely. They argued that Al-Qaeda's actions had brought ruin, causing the slaughter of thousands of young Muslims who now face this relentless American counterterrorism machine.
They pointed out that the Ummah was demonstrably worse off.
Exactly. They concluded that while Al-Qaeda tried to ignite a clash of civilizations, it lacked the means to wage, let alone win a global struggle against the world's leading superpower. They saw 9/11 as a moral and strategic suicide mission.
And beyond the strategy, the moral implications of targeting civilians also led to this significant loss of legitimacy among the wider Muslim public, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The indiscriminate targeting of civilians became the primary factor that alienated mainstream Muslim opinion. For most Muslims, Al-Qaeda stood accused of having brought the enemy, in the form of a massive military invasion, directly to their doorstep.
They suffered a grave crisis of legitimacy and authority.
A grave crisis. In many countries, the flow of intelligence on Al-Qaeda suspects started to come from citizens, from family members, from neighbors. It showed this widespread hardening of public sentiment against their reckless violence.
So the conclusion of the second wave is stark. Bin Laden's grand strategy to provoke total war. It worked, in that it achieved the military confrontation he desired.
It did.
But it resulted in the destruction of Al-Qaeda's physical base, the neutralization of its core leadership by 2003, and widespread condemnation from the very community it claimed to champion.
It was a strategic, operational, and ideological defeat for Al-Qaeda Central. By 2003, the initial core leadership that engineered the global confrontation was neutralized. That really marks the end of its dominance as a cohesive, functioning fighting force.
Al-Qaeda Central was defeated, yes. But the massive U.S. response had an unintended, devastating, and profound consequence that would immediately breathe new life into radicalism.
And that consequence was the invasion and subsequent occupation of Iraq, which began in 2003. This catastrophic instability created a new, chaotic breeding ground.
A vacuum.
And in this vacuum, figures like Abu Musab al-Zarqawi emerged. Zarqawi consciously rejected the relative strategic restraint of Al-Qaeda Central. He aggressively attacked Iraqi civilians. He fostered intense sectarian strife, and he created a level of localized barbarism and focus that would define the next phase of global jihad.
And that sets the stage entirely for our next deep dive. The rise of the third wave of global jihad, dominated by ISIS and its drive to establish a territorial caliphate, building directly on the wreckage that the defeat of Al-Qaeda Central unintentionally created.
A whole new chapter.
Join us next time for that evolution.